Hello. Well, I have to take a break from matters international, don't I? And that's better. I have to take a break from matters international and talk about the local elections here in Britain, because they're a very good bellwether of the political situation and the feelings of the country. For those of you unfamiliar with the British voting system, there's the local councils, and then there's the national elections. In 2019, it was the national elections. This time it was the local councils, and people use that as a means of telling the government how they feel about their direction of travel since the national election. And indeed, the verdict hasn't been quite as bad as the press were bigging it up to be. Just before the elections, especially stuff like The Guardian and the New Statesman and things like that, they were saying, the Conservative parties are going to have a wipeout in these elections. And actually, they didn't have a wipeout. There was the dog agrees with me. There was a definite dropping off of Conservative votes, but the Conservatives did hang on to most of the so-called red wall towns, except in one or two cases. And as the Labour sympathising papers had it, Labour has more work to do. Yet Labour has a lot more than more work to do. It's got to change its entire mind. But where the Conservatives lost most decisively was in London, a city which, well, it was already mostly a Labour city. So one of the big problems with the Labour Party at the moment is it is consolidating its votes in places it already has, which, it sounds good. And when they report on how they did during the elections, they can say, well, look, we increased our vote from whatever it was, 20,000 to 30,000 in some London borough. It wouldn't be that much. It's very unusual for anything more than a difference of between 5,000 votes, but I'll get onto that in a minute. So they can say that, they're doing so much better, but they're doing better in places they already have. There were one or two towns that had gone Conservative that went back to Labour, but not as many as had been confidently predicted by organs, and I'm using that word advisedly, like The Guardian. Right, so the general consensus is that it's the cost of living that has caused this drifting away from Conservatives. And of course, no group feels the cost of living more harshly, more closely than those people in the ex-industrial towns in what we would call depressed economies. So you can ask why they didn't turn against the Conservatives more decisively. And my suggestion is that one of the biggest problems is Labour's difficulty in defining a woman. I'm not saying that's the only reason. What I am saying is that it's symptomatic of the Labour attitude to life generally, and the more basic, commonsensical people in these towns, that the ex-red wall towns, that I have to point out to Americans. In Britain, red means Labour Party, blue means Conservatives. It's a little the other way round to America. So those red wall towns used to be solid Labour voters, and now they are not exactly solid Labour voters. They're but not exactly solid Conservative voters either, and no party can rely on them anymore. And the other thing that those people are very aware of is that the rising cost of living has to do with the COVID lockdowns. The country had to spend a lot of money supporting people during those times of isolation. And of course, it all has to be paid for. And although nobody likes it, we all know why it happened. And we also know that it shouldn't have been done like that, in large part, but that Labour would have done it much worse than the Conservatives. They would have enforced much more stringent and longer lockdowns. They're on record for demanding that. Now let's talk about London, where the Conservatives lost spectacularly, and we have to consider why. Well, at least one of the reasons could be this. Here's an article about somebody called Lutfur Rahman. And he lost his office in 2014 because of widespread and completely unhidden electoral fraud. It was absolutely out in the open that his party were doing all sorts of cheating. At the time, just a minute, I'm checking something. Yes, I was just checking because I was going to say that he was, that Lutfur Rahman was a Labour mayor and politician before being thrown, well, not thrown out of the party, but suspended because of electoral fraud. And then I was just checking that I was right. But you see, I'd made that assumption that he was Labour because they're all Labour in this situation, this particular type of situation. The Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities are solid Labour voters. In general, not all, obviously. But, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. Let's see, am I still recording? Yep. All right. He was, so what he is now, he's in a new party called the Aspire Party. He's out of Labour altogether, and he was elected with an enormous majority. I said before that it's unusual for there to be more than 5,000 votes in it. Well, he got 40,804 votes to Labour's John Briggs, who was about 30,000 and something votes. So it was an enormous majority. And who voted for him? Well, I wasn't at the polling stations, but I'll make a guess. And it's a guess that it was people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi voting bloc, out of which he comes. In some cases, people will have voted for him off their own bat, but in, I'd say, possibly as many as half the cases, it's because they were coerced. Either they were leaned on, men who were leaned on to vote for Rahman by the sort of close-knit community ethic that's a general rule in this borough, which is called Tower Hamlets. But it's especially women in this situation and older people who are the most vulnerable. They'd be told, well, you know, you can't go to the polling station. It's not appropriate. You have to vote either by proxy, you have to give somebody your proxy vote, or you have to fill out a postal vote. Well, when they fill out postal votes, they bring the votes to the house, and then the pater familias fills them out and seals them and sends them back. It's a very, very common thing in those communities. I mean, it's well known that it happens in the Turkish community in Haringey, for instance. And it's not only the Muslim groups that do this. I've heard about it happening among the Greeks. I have a few friends who have mentioned this. I've never discussed it with them all that closely. So let's get back to Lutfur Rahman. the people who did vote for him off his own bat would have done so because voting patronage and fraud is part of the Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage. It is a cultural thing. Nobody makes any bones about that, and you can see what it does to the countries. It did nothing for Pakistan or Bangladesh, and it will do nothing for Tower Hamlets as well. But it is becoming an established cultural norm. It happened in Peterborough very famously too. As I said, I had a Greek neighbour who once told me he couldn't understand why anyone in his community would vote for anything but a Greek candidate, simply because he's a Greek candidate. And I said, why? So he said, well, you can go to whoever it is and you can ask for favours. That's what he said to me. So it's not just the Muslims who are doing this, but it is more prevalent among people from that sort of background. So also, and you can't discount this, a lot of the Muslims in Tower Hamlets would be voting against Labour simply because they didn't like their woke agenda. They didn't like the idea that you can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. They didn't like they really don't like the Labour attitude to homosexuals, for instance, of either sex. So there's a whole load of reasons why Lutfur Rahman won, and why his Aspire party will be embedded in Tower Hamlets for a long time. It's not only in Tower Hamlets, of course. There are other areas of Britain where there's these sorts of shenanigans going on. It doesn't bode well for London. It doesn't bode well for those towns where this stranglehold is obvious either. Right, it doesn't bode well for London statuary either, now I come to think of it. I just want to point out that it used to be that the adverts on the London Underground, when you went down the escalators, and if you look at old photographs of all these respectable bowler-hatted gents in the 1950s getting on the escalator and going down to the depths of the earth to catch their trains to work in the morning, you'll see there are all these adverts on the walls by the side of the escalators, and nearly all of them feature women in underwear of various sorts. Well, as soon as Sadiq Khan came in became Mayor of London, all those adverts went. And they're all now nice scenes of various things and film and show adverts instead. And it's quite obvious that Khan did this to pander to Muslim sensibilities. And this was not remarked on at all by anyone. Well, he got a faint mention in some of the more conservative press, and that's it. So it's, there's this, I got very worried about that, not because I'm desperate to see women in underwear on the underground, but because it seemed to me to be the thin end of the wedge. And so I'll give my advice to the Conservative Party as if any of them would be listening to this vlog or even taking any notice of me. But I have to say this. What the Conservatives have to do to hang on to the rest of the country is to devote the rest of this parliamentary session to cutting the rules that have accrued over the few years, the Tony Blair years, and then the Cameron years, which were really just a Tony Blair continuation, really, to go through the EU red tape laws, to ditch all the hate crime and anti-free speech laws, and allow people room to breathe. That will make a real difference between the restrictive and idealistic, in the worst sense of the word, woke Labour ideas and the freedom of what a Conservative Party really should be. Well, that's my two penneth for what it's worth. Okay, well, I'm Granny Opterix. I am on YouTube, Rumble, BitChute and Minds as @Grannyopterix. I'm on Twitter, Gab and Parler, and I let you know when I've uploaded a new video. Right, yeah, please click like on this video. Make sure your subscription is live, support this channel, and till next time. Why not treat yourself or a favoured relative or friend to these magnificent examples of merch? The mugs and t-shirts come in the Graniopteryx design or Grambo with a firearm or the more deadly knitting needles. Go to www.graniopteryx.com and whatever platform you're watching this on, please click like, subscribe and share.